Have you ever had a conversation with someone like this?
I am Groot.
No! No, that's the button that will kill everyone! Try again.
I am Groot.
Mm-hmm.
I am Groot.
Uh-huh.
I'm Groot.
No!
That's sort of how Thomas Paine felt in 1776 with the colonists. More on him in a bit, but let's lay some groundwork and some background knowledge about what the colonists were going through during this time. We learned that some delegates, like our eventual second president, John Adams, was all for it and was ready to rock and roll. Meanwhile, there were a few delegates that weren't as eager as John Adams and were hoping for one last chance to make things right with Great Britain. It's safe to assume that if these important delegates were unsure about declaring independence, then the colonists that they were representing were feeling the same way too. And in fact, you'd be right. While a lot of the colonists were rightfully upset with Great Britain about their unfair laws being passed, a lot of them still wanted to remain loyal. Plus, and this is probably more likely the reason, a lot of the colonists didn't think they could win a war against the mighty British troops. If you haven't noticed by now, a lot of the videos we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks have been about people's freedom and having their voice be heard. In fact, this concept wasn't being talked about in just America. It was being discussed all over Europe, too. Check it out.
In the mid-1700s, people in Europe were exploring new ideas about science, government, and human rights. One key idea was that all people should have freedom and fair treatment under the law. This time is called the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. Writers of the period published their ideas in newspapers, pamphlets, and booklets. These ideas spread through Europe and the American colonies.
So isn't it interesting that the very idea the colonists were wanting Great Britain to understand was actually being talked about in Great Britain's backyard in Europe? Like I said, this wasn't just a colonial thing. Almost everyone was writing about this, including the man of the hour, Thomas Paine, who, coincidentally, wrote a book called The Age of Reason.
One man who believed in these new ideas was Thomas Paine. In 1774, Paine came to the colonies from England. In January of 1776, he published a pamphlet called Common Sense, which argued that people should rule themselves rather than be ruled by a king. America, Paine said, could show the world a better form of government.
Almost every important colonial influencer we've talked about so far has come from the colonies. But then Thomas Paine shows up from England just 2 years before history is made in the colonies. So a man who just came from living under the rule of a king is now in America and claiming, guys, we don't need one. We can actually one-up the government in Great Britain. But how did he do this? How did Thomas Paine get a group of people that weren't really sure about their declaring independence and then turning them into a group that's ready to go? Well, if Paine was around in the modern day, I would say he'd make a pretty good teacher. Why do I say this? Well, look at what he did when he was writing Common Sense.
Common Sense reached many people because Paine wrote simply in words that all could understand. Many colonists still thought of Great Britain as their parent country, but Paine said that parents do not make war upon their families. The blood of the patriots killed in Massachusetts, he wrote, cried out that it was time to separate from Great Britain. He said the colonists could defeat the British army.
I'll let you in on a little teacher trick. Just like Thomas Paine did, we take big challenging concepts and break them down into easy to understand words and simple examples for you. In this case, Paine used the colonists' own words and thoughts to support his arguments. Did you notice the bit about the colonists saying Great Britain was their parent country? Paine certainly did, and he took advantage of it with this awesome quote here that says, "Parents do not make war upon their families." And this basically means that a good parent shouldn't be mistreating their children, but this is exactly what Great Britain is doing with all their unfair laws. It's a shame that all you avid readers out there weren't around when bookstores were at the height of their popularity and power. When a popular new book came out, the stores were basically like Black Friday. Case in point, this picture is when the last Harry Potter book came out on sale in 2007. The books were flying off the shelves. The reason I bring this up is because this is almost what it was like when Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. Take a look at just how many copies he sold.
Soon, more than 500,000 copies of Common Sense had been sold. Never before had so many copies of one book been published in the colonies. People everywhere read it, including soldiers in the Continental Army. George Washington wrote that Common Sense was changing minds. By the spring of 1776, many people were ready to support a vote for independence.
500,000 is a crazy number when considering the following.
In 1776, the population of Virginia was 747,610 people. 500,000 is equivalent to 67% of the entire population of the colony of Virginia. Even crazier, the population of Massachusetts in 1776 was 378,787 people, which means if Common Sense was only sold in Massachusetts, there would still be 121,213 copies of the pamphlet laying around.
The point is, this piece of writing influenced a vast majority of the people who were unsure about whether to declare independence or not. Paine's simple writing made it easy for the colonists to understand what was at stake. And when the newly appointed leader of the Continental Army, George Washington himself, said that it was a good pamphlet, it essentially tipped the scales, and by the spring of 1776, the colonists were ready. But guys, that's going to do it for today's Daily Dose of History. Head back over to the Google Classroom and answer today's question of the day. And don't forget, on Friday, we'll be having our Zoom discussion to review everything we've talked about so far, so be on the lookout for an invitation to that in your school email. Next time on our Daily Dose of History, we'll talk about the writing process of the Declaration, so I'll see you right here tomorrow.